like she wanted to rip his head off and all of this stuff. Ennes Kanter was escorted out of the game. Natasha Cloud can't control herself per usual. Now I'm going to say this. I get the message, with Ennes Kanter. My whole thing is this ain't...
Ennes Kanter thought he was just watching Indiana Fever take on the Chicago Sky, but before the night was over, security was reportedly moving in, and the entire arena had turned its attention toward Brittany Griner. What exactly happened between Kanter and Griner? What did he do that caused such chaos? And why are fans still arguing over the moment? Did one confrontation turn an ordinary WNBA game into total madness?
Glad we're not there. All right, trans activists and Sophie Cunningham supporters squared off ahead of tonight's Indiana Fever and New York. Yeah, much different interview there. But this comes as WNBA Commissioner Kathy Engelbert is accusing others of using the debate to, quote, sow divisiveness, while Cunningham calls for bold new leadership in the league.
There are nights when a basketball game is supposed to be about basketball, and then there are nights when a 6'10" former NBA center shows up courtside wearing a shirt that immediately turns the arena into the world's most uncomfortable group discussion.
Okay.
Hiccups.
Let's get into
fired up.
Yeah. Woo.
That dude who wants to qualify for the WNBA, what's his name?
Kanter.
Yeah, he just did trigonometry.
Oh, jeez.
Freedom.
Yeah.
Rounds.
Hilarious.
He's getting into podcasting.
Yeah, of course. Smart move. Look, it's a great move for him. They've painted themselves into the most loony position where they can't define what a woman is.
I like when he went after LeBron.
What do you say?
And he's like, hey, you're always stopping about human rights, then you're like saying NBA should go to China?
The Indiana Fever were facing the Chicago Sky, the players were trying to focus on the game, and the WNBA was already dealing with one of the most controversial debates surrounding women's sports. Then Ennes Kanter freedom arrived, and suddenly the basketball became almost secondary to the man sitting near the baseline.
Out Natasha Cloud lost her mind on Ennes Kanter today, caused the whole big scene. We got to get into it. Hold on. Before we get to the Caitlin Clark highlights, Natasha Cloud.
6-point basketball, Chicago State.
You got Natasha Cloud. And at this point, I'm thinking Natasha Cloud's going at a player. She's going at it with Ennes Kanter. Oh, my God. Ennes Kanter was kicked out of the game. He was kicked out of the game. They had to kick him out.
What happened next was not some harmless celebrity appearance, and it was certainly not Ennes quietly enjoying a game while eating overpriced arena popcorn and pretending that everything was normal.
Brittany Griner is playing a game, and this is what Brittany Griner calls. I was not going to comment on any of this stuff until this took place. Watch what she says. The entire internet has reacted to this. Here's Brittany Griner. They're playing against the Indiana Fever, and look what she's saying.
All right, Behan, I seen your tweet, but I ain't never seen an off night like with BG. That's
I told
crazy.
y'all.
Might spin on that.
Hell no. I told y'all.
That's your choice, brother. Leave your truth.
What? Now, when I told y'all last year that she might have an off night, she don't always want to be a nigga.
Instead, a confrontation erupted. Chicago Sky guard Natasha Cloud found herself face-to-face with the former NBA player. Security rushed toward the situation, and Kanter was eventually escorted away from the court area. The remarkable part, however, is that the confrontation did not begin in a vacuum. Ennes Kanter had spent the previous weeks placing himself directly in the middle of the WNBA's growing argument over transgender eligibility and the definition of who should be allowed to compete in women's professional basketball. He had publicly declared himself eligible for the 2027 WNBA draft, saying that he identified as a woman and arguing that the league's written eligibility language did not clearly answer every question being raised. And that is where this story becomes far bigger than one argument near the baseline. Because Kanter was not simply asking whether he could play basketball, he was challenging the league to explain exactly where the line was. The WNBA has long been identified as a professional league for women, and its collective bargaining language, which is about as subtle as naming a restaurant Pizza Palace, and then acting surprised when people expect to find pizza inside. To others, gender identity and inclusion are more complicated than simply relying on the traditional understanding of the league's name. That disagreement is exactly why the issue became explosive.
Indiana scores 113 points, and sitting courtside, a former NBA center who wants to enter the WNBA draft next season. Yeah, arguing with a Chicago Sky player before being kicked out. But this is no longer an isolated incident. Everywhere the Fever travel, the controversy surrounding Sophie Cunningham's comments seems to follow them. There have been rallies and counter-protests in Seattle, in Portland, in Minnesota, in Chicago, in New York. Sophie has been booed, fans have been confronted, and now the controversy has moved from outside the arena to courtside. The WNBA keeps saying it wants everyone to focus on
And Ennes Kanter decided that instead of quietly posting another opinion online, he would turn himself into the most provocative hypothetical candidate imaginable. A former NBA player standing 6'10" and publicly declaring for the WNBA draft was never going to be treated as an ordinary basketball announcement. The entire point was to force attention onto the rules. Kanter's critics immediately argued that his declaration was not a sincere attempt to live as a transgender woman, but rather a political stunt designed to mock transgender people and provoke the league. His supporters saw something completely different. Fans began arguing about the purpose of women's sports. Players found themselves caught in the middle of a debate they had not created, and commentators suddenly treated a question about league eligibility as though someone had accidentally scheduled a constitutional convention during halftime. Then Kanter took the controversy one step further by attending the Indiana Fever versus Chicago Sky game, which transformed an argument that had largely existed online into a very real courtside spectacle. He was seated near the baseline, wearing a black shirt, displaying a definition of the word woman, which was not exactly the kind of wardrobe choice designed to help a 6'10" former NBA player quietly disappear into the crowd. If his objective had been invisibility, then he had chosen the wrong shirt, the wrong seat, the wrong league, and possibly the wrong continent.
Oh man, hey, Ennes Kanter gets kicked out of the WNBA game. You know, he's trying to get in the WNBA draft. He's identifying as a woman, and Natasha Cloud had some words for him after she made a beautiful layup. Hey, look at this, man. Look, he was arguing with her. Like, he's arguing with a woman. Like, there's a lot going on right here. Getting him kicked out. What's your thoughts on this? Like, I'd like to know your thoughts. I have an opinion. Like, what is he doing? Really, like, what is he doing? Like, arguing with women like you're about to...
As the game continued, however, it became increasingly clear that Kanter's presence was attracting attention. Late in the third quarter, Natasha Cloud scored inside, and Indiana called a timeout shortly afterward. What happened next quickly became the moment that overshadowed much of the basketball itself, because Cloud turned her attention toward Kanter and began yelling and pointing in his direction as she approached. Kanter then stood and moved toward the court area while holding his arms out, which immediately brought security personnel and players into the situation. Although the confrontation did not develop into a physical altercation, it had already moved far beyond an ordinary disagreement between a spectator and a player. The scene had become a direct confrontation involving an active WNBA player, a former NBA center, and a controversy that had already been simmering for weeks. Security eventually escorted Kanter away from the court area, adding another draw attention to that argument. Instead of remaining an abstract debate about policy and rulebooks, the controversy had now become something that players were confronting directly inside the arena. Chicago's players were understandably not interested in allowing the post-game conversation to become entirely consumed by a political dispute, as their primary responsibility was to compete and focus on the game. However, Kanter's removal ensured that the controversy became another major headline, and it pushed the larger questions surrounding the WNBA's eligibility standards even further into the spotlight.
Is Brittany Griner a man or a woman?
Her voice is crazy.
Is it? I haven't heard it. It's a man's voice.
To be different and special for you.
I mean, one just...
Holy
but this did happen, so we have to include it. Natasha Cloud crashed out on Ennes Kanter. I'm sure she'll have something else to say on social media, or if they talk to her in a post game, because she can't. I'll be covering it like white on rice.
The central issue did not disappear when security escorted Kanter away. In many ways, the incident made the underlying question even more difficult to avoid, because people were now asking exactly what the WNBA's policy says and whether a league specifically created for women should define its eligibility standards with greater precision before someone deliberately attempts to test the boundaries. That is where the conversation becomes considerably more complicated, because people approaching this debate are often physical advantages. From that viewpoint, women's professional leagues require clear and enforceable eligibility categories, because the entire purpose of creating a separate women's competition becomes increasingly difficult to explain if the boundaries of that category remain unclear. Another perspective argues that transgender athletes should not automatically be excluded, and that questions of eligibility should account for gender identity, medical transition, competitive fairness, and other individual circumstances. Supporters of that position argue that blanket rules may create unfair exclusions, and that sports organizations should carefully develop policies rather than treating every athlete or every situation as identical.
This was Ennes Kanter's situation with Natasha Cloud during the game. Let's
And
play.
right before the break,
Talk all that stuff on the internet. This is Escorted Ennes Kanter's out the arena.
These are serious questions involving fairness, inclusion, competition, and the future of women's sports, which means they require serious policies rather than vague language and endless public confusion. What does not resolve the disagreement is pretending that the question will disappear if nobody is willing to discuss what the eligibility rules actually mean. At the same time, the broader political argument should not become an excuse for turning individual athletes into targets, particularly when those athletes were not responsible for creating the controversy in the first place. That distinction is especially important in the Kanter story because Brittany Griner was not involved in the verified confrontation at the Fever Sky game. Although Griner has frequently been pulled into online discussions and criticism adds several imaginary details, change the names of the people involved, and then present the finished product to millions of people as though it arrived on stone tablets from the top of a mountain. In this case, the verified story was already dramatic enough without inventing Brittany Griner as a participant in the confrontation. The larger controversy had begun well before Kanter entered the arena, and it appears unlikely to disappear simply because security escorted him away. The WNBA has publicly maintained that there were no immediate eligibility matters affecting the league, while criticizing efforts that it described as bad faith attempts to demean or marginalize others.
Ennes Kanter Freedom, the former NBA player who has officially declared for the WNBA draft next season, did show up to the Sky versus the Fever game. And after Natasha Cloud sinks a bucket, she does just kind of start mouthing off to Ennes Kanter Freedom. I don't know if they were going back and forth at each other earlier in the game, but he puts out his arms. He basically wants all of the smoke from Tosh Cloud, who is absolutely livid with the idea that this person from the NBA would actually declare for the WNBA, and we don't.
At the same time, critics have continued questioning whether the league's existing language provides sufficient clarity regarding who is eligible to compete. Kanter's declaration that he intended to enter the 2027 WNBA draft was essentially a public challenge to that ambiguity. His argument appeared to be that if the rules are already clear, then the league should be able to explain those rules clearly and consistently. If the language leaves unanswered questions, however, then someone testing those boundaries in the most public way imaginable was almost inevitable. That is why his appearance at the Fever Sky game generated so much controversy. To his supporters, Kanter was forcing the WNBA and the wider sports world to confront a question that many institutions would prefer to discuss carefully behind closed doors. To his critics, however, his actions were not a sincere attempt to participate in a policy discussion, but rather a provocative performance that used transgender identity as it entered the arena and taken a seat near the court. When an active player reacted, the entire controversy transformed into the kind of scene that causes every camera in the building to become extremely important within about 3 seconds. There is also a more uncomfortable reality beneath the entire episode, because professional sports leagues cannot rely indefinitely on vague language when the issue being debated is this controversial. Whether someone supports a sex-based eligibility system, a gender identity-based system, or a policy involving specific medical standards, there will eventually be demands for clarity.
With Brittany Griner, I think some of this is arrogance as well. I think when you live in a country and you get to a certain high profile and a status, you feel like you can do no wrong and there are no consequences. Again, you talk about not being the smartest person in the pile. It's like I would tell Stephen A. Smith, you've got to stop looking at this like we look at it over here. It is not run over there like it is run over here. We are in a way different situation.
Number one, let's ignore them damn idiots who say such a thing about her, talking about she violated the laws. I don't want to hear that crap from them.
You say, oh, well, she only got caught with having gram of cannabis, is bloviating, whatever. Well, guess what? You did it in Russia. Okay, that's a totally different animal.
A sports league has the right to establish its own eligibility policies, defend those policies, and revise them when circumstances or evidence require a different approach. However, ambiguity becomes increasingly difficult to maintain when athletes, activists, critics, and political figures are all searching for the precise point where the written rules meet real-world consequences. Kanter has made it clear that he intends to continue pressing that particular question. Of course, his declaration for the WNBA draft does not mean that a team is suddenly preparing to hand a former NBA center a jersey and ask him to report to training camp. There are league procedures, eligibility requirements, draft processes, and team decisions involved, and publicly declaring for a draft does not obligate any organization to select or sign a particular player. Still, Kanter's campaign has succeeded in exposing a larger disagreement about what the league's rules mean and whether those rules should be more specific. Nevertheless, the controversy is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. Kanter has forced a public discussion about eligibility, while Cloud's reaction demonstrated just how personal and emotionally charged that discussion has become for many people involved in women's basketball. The WNBA has defended the need to protect individuals from efforts to demean or marginalize them, while also maintaining that there are no immediate eligibility matters currently affecting the league.
The WNBA won't take a hard stance on, I guess, biological males entering the WNBA. This is one of those, oh yeah, well, if you're going to get caught smoking a cigarette, I'm going to make you smoke a pack of cigarettes type of thing. And Ennes Kanter Freedom and another NBA player declared for the WNBA draft and are basically putting this ideology to the test. But I mean, before Ennes, that's such a, I'm just going to call him Freedom. Ennes Kanter Freedom. Before he ended up going into the arena, he was getting a lot of smoke. He was getting flipped off. I mean, he got ejected from the game after the back and forth with Tosh Cloud.
Fans, meanwhile, remain deeply divided about what the future should look like. Some believe women's professional sports should establish explicitly sex-based eligibility standards in order to preserve a protected category for female athletes. Others believe policies must also consider transgender identity and should avoid unnecessarily excluding athletes through rules that fail to account for individual circumstances. The WNBA now finds itself a provocateur, a political stuntman, or perhaps a 6'10" walking comment section who somehow managed to bring the internet directly into the arena. However, the Fever Sky game also demonstrated that there is an important difference between raising a controversial question and bringing that controversy directly into the middle of an active sporting event. Natasha Cloud clearly believed Kanter's presence and message crossed a line, while Kanter clearly believed that his protest was necessary to expose what he viewed as an unresolved problem. Security ultimately decided that the situation had escalated far enough, and the man who had arrived to challenge the WNBA's rules was no longer sitting courtside by the end of the confrontation.
Yeah, it seems as if the drama never stops. The drama seems to be more entertaining than the actual play, right? And that is, again, why we're talking about the WNBA, okay? A league that now is facing protests where you have individuals, women, standing up for girls in girls sports, women in women's sports. I mean, basically standing up for the WNBA, in the existence of the WNBA, which is something that the WNBA seems to not appreciate, right? And this story right here, I think, is a great example of that, as you have Ennes Kanter Freedom. He showed up, or she showed up to a WNBA game in Chicago. It was the Indiana Fever versus the Chicago Sky. And as we all know, Ennes Kanter Freedom has declared for the WNBA draft.
Instead, he was being escorted away while cameras captured the scene, leaving the league with the same difficult questions that had existed before he ever entered the building. Will the WNBA eventually provide more detailed eligibility standards? Will Kanter continue pursuing his declared attempt to enter the 2027 draft? Will other athletes or activists attempt to join his campaign? And will this controversy push other women's sports organizations to examine their own policies more closely? Perhaps the biggest question is whether sports leagues can develop rules that provide genuine clarity and competitive fairness while also former NBA player being escorted away from courtside. It represented a much broader question that had been growing quietly in the background until someone decided to bring it directly into the arena and force everyone watching to confront it. Now that the debate has moved beyond social media and into the building itself, the WNBA may find that the most difficult part is no longer avoiding the conversation. The real challenge will be deciding how clearly it wants to answer the question that Ennes Kanter Freedom has spent weeks forcing into the spotlight.